The morning sun filtered through the thin curtains, painting soft golden stripes across the walls of a modest apartment. A faint hum of life began stirring outside, cars honking, children laughing on their way to school, and the occasional bark of a neighborhood dog. Inside, however, the air was quiet and heavy, as if weighed down by unspoken words and invisible burdens. Sitting at the small dining table was Clara, a woman in her mid-30s, with a mug of untouched coffee growing cold in her hands. Her dark brown hair, tied back hastily, revealed tired eyes that hinted at sleepless nights. The apartment was neat but bare, with only the essentials, a reflection of a life stripped down to its basics. Clara wasn't always like this. There was a time when her laughter could light up a room, when her dreams stretched far beyond the horizon. But life, as it often does, had other plans. Over the years, a series of small disappointments and crushing losses had worn her spirit thin. A failed marriage, a career that never quite took off, and the growing distance from people she once called friends had left her feeling like a shadow of herself. This particular morning, Clara found herself staring at an envelope on the table. It was from her old college roommate, Emily, a woman who seemed to have everything figured out, a successful career, a loving family, and an Instagram feed that sparkled with pictures of exotic vacations and perfectly arranged brunches. The letter inside was an invitation to Emily's upcoming retreat, a weekend in the mountains, focused on finding purpose and rediscovering joy. Clara sighed, her fingers tracing the edges of the envelope. She had no intention of going. The idea of spending a weekend surrounded by strangers, pretending to be interested in motivational exercises, felt exhausting. Yet, deep down, a tiny spark of curiosity flickered. What if this retreat could offer her something she didn't know she needed? What if there was a way out of this endless loop of exhaustion and despair? Her phone buzzed, snapping her out of her thoughts. It was her mother, leaving another voicemail that Clara would likely ignore. They hadn't spoken much since Clara's divorce, and every conversation seemed to end with her mother's thinly veiled disappointment. She placed the phone face down on the table, her gaze drifting back to the envelope. Finally, with a resigned sigh, Clara tore it open. The brochure inside was beautifully designed, filled with images of serene landscapes and smiling faces. The words, "A Journey to Rediscover Happiness," were printed boldly across the top. Clara's lips twisted into a skeptical half-smile. Happiness. It felt like such a distant, almost laughable concept. But something about the simplicity of the message tugged at her. She folded the brochure and slipped it into her bag, telling herself she'd think about it later. Later came sooner than she expected. That evening, after another lonely dinner and a half-hearted attempt at watching a TV show, Clara found herself scrolling through the retreat's website. The testimonials were filled with stories of transformation, people who had found clarity, healed broken relationships, or simply learned to let go of their pain. The cynic in her wanted to dismiss it all as marketing fluff, but the ache in her chest reminded her of how desperately she wanted something, anything, to change. By the time she clicked the register button, it felt less like a decision and more like an act of surrender. What did she have to lose? She booked a spot, packed a small suitcase, and left the next morning, barely giving herself time to second-guess. The retreat center was nestled in the heart of the mountains, surrounded by towering pines and the sound of a rushing river. As Clara stepped out of the cab, the crisp air hit her lungs, startling in its freshness. She was greeted by a cheerful woman named Lily, who handed her a name tag and a schedule for the weekend. Clara noticed the other attendees milling about, some chatting in small groups, others sitting quietly, soaking in the scenery. She felt out of place, unsure of what to say or do. The first session was held in a cozy hall with large windows overlooking the forest. The facilitator, a charismatic man named Daniel, began with a simple question: "When was the last time you felt truly happy?" The room grew quiet as everyone considered the question. Clara's mind raced, sifting through memories that felt like they belonged to someone else. She thought of childhood summers spent riding bikes with her cousins, the thrill of getting her first job offer, the warmth of her grandmother's hugs. But each memory felt like a snapshot from a distant past, unconnected to the person she was now. As the session progressed, Daniel shared his own story, a tale of loss, resilience, and rediscovery that left the room in stunned silence. Clara found herself hanging on to his every word, her skepticism melting away. For the first time in years, she felt a glimmer of something she couldn't quite name. Hope, perhaps? Or maybe just the realization that she wasn't as alone as she thought. But just as Clara began to let her guard down, Daniel posed another question that hit her like a punch to the gut. What are you holding on to that's holding you back? Clara's mind went blank. She wanted to dismiss the question, to convince herself it didn't apply to her. But deep down, she knew the truth. There were things she had buried so deep that even thinking about them felt unbearable. And now, sitting in this room full of strangers, she was being asked to confront them. The session ended, and Clara stepped outside, the cool air stinging her cheeks. She wandered down a trail, her thoughts swirling in a storm of emotions. She didn't notice the time passing until she found herself at the edge of a clearing, the sky painted in hues of orange and pink as the sun began to set. In that moment, something shifted. The stillness of the landscape, the beauty of the colors. It was as if the world was telling her it was okay to pause, to breathe, to feel. As she made her way back to the retreat center, Clara realized that this weekend was going to be more challenging and possibly more transformative than she had anticipated. She didn't have the answers yet, but for the first time in a long time, she felt ready to ask the questions. And perhaps that was enough. As Clara walked back toward the retreat center, the scent of pine filled the cool evening air. The clearing she had stumbled upon felt like a small reprieve, but the weight of Daniel's question lingered, tugging at her thoughts. What was she holding on to that kept her stuck? The answer wasn't clear, but the ache in her chest told her that whatever it was, it ran deep. She tried to shake the thought as she approached the soft glow of the center's lights, but it clung to her, refusing to be ignored. The dining hall was buzzing when she entered, filled with quiet conversations and the sound of cutlery clinking against plates. Clara found a corner seat by the window, away from the chatter. She wasn't ready to make small talk yet, though she could feel the curious glances from a few of the other participants. A young woman with auburn curls sat down across from her with a warm smile. "I'm Mia," the woman said, her voice cheerful but not intrusive. "Mind if I join you?" Clara hesitated but nodded. Mia didn't seem like the kind of person who needed permission to sit down, but there was something unassuming about her that made Clara feel at ease. "You look like you've had a long day," Mia said gently, studying Clara's face. Clara gave a small, tired laugh. "Something like that." Mia nodded, her expression understanding. "Yeah, me too. I almost didn't come here. Honestly, I thought the idea of a happiness retreat sounded a little ridiculous, but here I am." Clara tilted her head, intrigued. "What changed your mind?" Mia hesitated, looking down at her plate, as if gathering her thoughts. "I guess I got tired of feeling stuck. I mean, I have a good life, you know? A job, friends, all the things you're supposed to have. But none of it feels enough." She glanced up, meeting Clara's eyes. "Does that make sense?" Clara nodded slowly. It made too much sense. "Yeah, it does." For the first time since arriving, Clara felt a flicker of connection. Mia's openness caught her off guard, but it also felt refreshing. The two women fell into an easy rhythm of conversation, sharing bits and pieces of their lives without diving too deep. Clara learned that Mia was a graphic designer who loved photography and hated mornings. In turn, Clara shared that she used to work in marketing but left her job after her divorce. She didn't elaborate, and Mia didn't press, which Clara appreciated. By the time they finished their meal, Clara felt a little lighter. Maybe it was the warmth of Mia's company, or maybe it was the simple act of talking to someone who didn't seem to expect anything from her. Either way, she was grateful. Later that night, back in her room, Clara lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The day had been more emotional than she'd anticipated, and her mind refused to quiet down. She thought about Daniel's question again, and the memories she had been avoiding began to surface, unbidden. She remembered the night she left her husband, the arguments that had led up to it, and the suffocating silence that followed. She thought about the job she had poured herself into, only to watch her hard work go unnoticed. And she thought about the friendships she had let slip away, one by one, because it was easier than admitting she needed help. A sharp pang of guilt hit her as she thought about her mother. They had always had a complicated relationship. Her mother was the kind of woman who thrived on perfection, and Clara had always fallen short of those expectations. But even so, there were moments of tenderness Clara couldn't ignore. Her mother's late-night phone calls after the divorce, her quiet attempts to check in despite Clara's resistance. Maybe she wasn't holding on to her mother's disappointment, Clara realized. Maybe she was holding on to her own. The next morning, the group gathered for another session. This one was about gratitude, a concept Clara had always found a little cliché. But Daniel had a way of framing things that felt genuine rather than preachy. He asked the group to think about a time when they felt truly grateful, not for something grand, but for something simple. As Clara listened to the others share their stories, she found herself thinking back to a memory she hadn't revisited in years. She was 10 years old, sitting in the kitchen of her grandmother's house, watching her bake cookies. Her grandmother had a way of making everything feel like an adventure, even something as ordinary as baking. Clara could still hear her grandmother's laugh, warm and full of life, as she handed her the mixing spoon and told her to make a wish. It was such a small, fleeting moment, but it was one of the happiest memories Clara had. When it was her turn to share, Clara hesitated. Her instinct was to stay quiet, but something about the atmosphere in the room made her feel safe enough to speak. "I used to spend summers with my grandmother when I was a kid," she began, her voice shaky. She had this way of making everything feel special, even the smallest things. "I remember sitting in her kitchen, watching her bake, and thinking it was the best place in the world." She paused, her throat tightening. "I didn't realize how much I missed that until now." The room was silent for a moment, and Clara felt a wave of vulnerability wash over her. But then Daniel smiled, his expression gentle. "That's a beautiful memory, Clara. Thank you for sharing." As the session continued, Clara found herself feeling a little more open, a little less guarded. The walls she had built around herself over the years weren't gone, but they were starting to crack. That afternoon, the group went on a hike to a nearby waterfall. The trail was steep and challenging, but the scenery was breathtaking: lush greenery, the sound of birdsong, and the distant roar of water growing louder with each step. Clara found herself walking next to Mia again, their conversation light and easy. When they reached the waterfall, Clara was struck by its sheer beauty. The water cascaded down a rocky cliff, shimmering in the sunlight like liquid silver. She stood there, mesmerized, as the mist kissed her skin. For the first time in a long time, she felt a sense of peace. It wasn't the kind of peace that came from having all the answers, it was the peace of being present, of letting go, even if just for a moment. As the group made their way back to the retreat center, Clara felt a strange mix of emotions. She was starting to see glimpses of something she hadn't felt in years, a sense of possibility. But with that came fear. Fear of confronting the parts of herself she had been avoiding, fear of facing the pain she had buried so deep. That evening, as she sat by the fire pit with Mia and a few others, Clara found herself opening up more than she expected. She listened to their stories, stories of heartbreak, resilience, and hope, and realized how much they echoed her own. It was humbling to see how universal their struggles were, how human it was to feel lost. But even as Clara began to feel a sense of connection, the question that Daniel had posed earlier still loomed large in her mind. What was she holding on to? And more importantly, was she ready to let it go? That night, Clara couldn't sleep. The warmth of the fire pit had faded, and the room felt colder than it should. She lay on the bed, staring at the shadows on the ceiling as her mind refused to settle. The voices from earlier echoed in her thoughts, the stories people had shared, the quiet strength they carried despite everything they'd been through. It was humbling and, at the same time, overwhelming. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was on the verge of something important, but she didn't know if she was ready to face it. She thought about the waterfall again, about the way the water fell without hesitation, crashing against the rocks before flowing onward. It was relentless, unstoppable. In a strange way, it reminded her of her grandmother. Clara could still picture her, strong and unwavering, even when life threw its hardest punches. Her grandmother had lost her husband young, raised 3 children on her own, and worked 2 jobs to make ends meet. And yet, she never seemed bitter. She had this unshakable belief that life, no matter how hard, was still worth living. Clara rolled onto her side, clutching the edge of the blanket. She missed her grandmother in a way she hadn't let herself feel before. It wasn't just the memories of the cookies or the summers in her kitchen. It was the way her grandmother had made her feel, seen, valued, loved. It was the way her presence had made Clara believe that she was capable of anything. But that belief had slipped away over the years, piece by piece, until Clara wasn't sure she could find it again. The next morning, the retreat schedule included a session called Facing the Mirror. The title alone made Clara uneasy. When she entered the room, she noticed small mirrors placed in front of each seat. The idea was simple. Participants would spend time looking at their reflections and writing down the first thoughts or feelings that came to mind. Clara took a deep breath and sat down, already feeling the knot in her stomach tighten. When Daniel began speaking, his tone was calm but firm. He explained that this exercise wasn't about judgment or criticism. It was about honesty, about seeing ourselves as we truly are, not as we wish to be or as others expect us to be. Clara hesitated before picking up the mirror. She didn't want to do this, didn't want to face whatever might come up. But something about Daniel's voice, or maybe the shared energy in the room, made her take the first step. She raised the mirror and looked at her reflection. For a moment, all she could see were the surface-level details, the tired eyes, the faint lines that hadn't been there a decade ago, the way her hair seemed to have lost its shine. But as she stared longer, something deeper began to emerge. She saw the sadness in her eyes, the hesitation in her expression, the fear that seemed to hover just beneath the surface. She saw a woman who had been running on empty for too long, trying to hold herself together while slowly unraveling inside. Clara felt her throat tighten as tears blurred her vision. She looked away, setting the mirror down. But the image lingered in her mind, refusing to let go. She reached for the notebook in front of her and began writing, not even sure where to start. The words came slowly at first, hesitant and jagged, but soon they began to flow. She wrote about her divorce, about the nights she spent lying awake, wondering if she had made the right decision. She wrote about the job she left because she couldn't handle the constant pressure and the feeling of never being enough. She wrote about her mother, about the unspoken tension between them and the guilt that came with every ignored phone call. When the session ended, Clara felt drained, as if she had poured out every ounce of energy she had left. But she also felt lighter, as if some of the weight she had been carrying had finally shifted. Daniel encouraged everyone to share, but he made it clear that it was optional. Clara stayed quiet, listening as others spoke about their own experiences. Their words were raw and unpolished, filled with pain and vulnerability. But there was also a thread of hope running through them, a sense that they were starting to see a way forward. Later that day, Clara found herself walking the trails again, needing space to process everything. The air was crisp, and the sound of leaves crunching beneath her boots was oddly soothing. She thought about the mirror exercise, about the things she had written down. It wasn't just the pain that stood out to her. It was the realization that she had been holding herself back in ways she hadn't even noticed. She had let fear and self-doubt dictate her choices, convincing herself that she wasn't capable of more. As she walked, she heard footsteps behind her. Turning, she saw Mia catching up, her face flushed from the cold. "Hey," Mia said, falling into step beside her. "Mind if I join you?" Clara shook her head, grateful for the company. They walked in silence for a while, the quiet between them comfortable. Finally, Mia spoke. "That session earlier, it was intense, huh?" Clara nodded, her gaze fixed on the trail ahead.
"Yeah.
I didn't think it would affect me as much as it did." Mia gave a small laugh. "Same here. It's weird, isn't it? How much we avoid looking at ourselves, even though we're always there. Clara glanced at her, surprised by the insight.
Yeah.
It's like, I don't know, like I've been avoiding myself for years. Mia nodded, her expression thoughtful. Me too. I think it's easier to stay busy, to focus on other things. But then you realize you're just running in circles. Clara didn't say anything, but Mia's words struck a chord. She thought about how she had thrown herself into work after her divorce, trying to fill the void with deadlines and distractions. She thought about how she had pushed people away, telling herself it was easier to be alone than to risk getting hurt again. But all it had done was leave her feeling more isolated. They reached a small clearing, and Mia stopped, looking out at the view. You know, she said after a moment, when I was a kid, my dad used to tell me this story about a bird. It was trapped in a cage for so long that even when the cage door was opened, it wouldn't leave. It didn't know how to fly anymore. Clara frowned, the story settling uncomfortably in her chest. That's sad. Mia shrugged. Yeah, but I think it's also kind of true. For a lot of us, anyway. We get so used to being stuck that we don't even realize the door's open. Clara didn't respond, but the image of the caged bird stayed with her. She wondered if she was like that bird, too afraid to spread her wings even when the opportunity was right in front of her. The thought was unsettling, but it also made her question what it would take to finally step out of the cage. As they walked back, Clara found herself thinking about the things she had always wanted, but had never let herself pursue. She thought about the life she had dreamed of when she was younger, a life filled with passion, creativity, and connection. She had convinced herself that it was too late, that she had missed her chance. But what if she was wrong? What if the door was open, and she just hadn't seen it yet? The question lingered, both terrifying and exhilarating. The final day of the retreat arrived with a sense of quiet anticipation. Clara woke up early, the morning air cool against her skin as she stepped outside to watch the sunrise. The horizon was streaked with shades of pink and gold, a fleeting beauty that made her chest tighten. She wanted to hold on to this moment, to the stillness and possibility it seemed to offer. But she knew it wouldn't last. The real world was waiting, with all its chaos and uncertainty, and she wasn't sure she was ready to face it. The schedule for the day was simple. One last group session, and then a closing ceremony. Clara felt a strange mix of dread and hope as she made her way to the meeting room. Part of her wanted to keep peeling back the layers she had started to uncover, but another part of her was terrified of what she might find. She wasn't sure she could handle it, wasn't sure she was strong enough. When she entered the room, she noticed a small object placed in the center of each seat, a single white feather. Daniel explained that it was a symbol of lightness, a reminder of the freedom they were all striving for. He asked everyone to hold the feather in their hands and think about what they wanted to let go of, what had been weighing them down. Clara stared at the feather in her palm, its softness a sharp contrast to the heaviness she felt inside. The question she had been wrestling with all week echoed in her mind. What am I holding on to? It felt like there were 1,000 answers, all tangled together in a knot she couldn't unravel. But as she sat there, something began to shift. The memories she had been avoiding started to surface, one after another, like pieces of a puzzle she hadn't realized she was solving. She thought about the arguments with her ex-husband, the way they had both held on to their own pain instead of reaching for each other. She thought about the countless times she had doubted herself, telling herself she wasn't good enough, smart enough, or brave enough to chase the life she wanted. And she thought about her mother, about the guilt and resentment she had carried for so long. For the first time, she saw it clearly. She wasn't just holding on to pain or regret. She was holding on to a version of herself that no longer existed, a version she had outgrown but hadn't been able to let go of. When it was her turn to share, Clara hesitated, her hands trembling slightly as she gripped the feather. The room was silent, everyone waiting. She took a deep breath, forcing herself to speak. I've been holding on to fear, she began, her voice barely above a whisper. Fear of failing, fear of being vulnerable, fear of not being enough. And I think I've let it control me for too long. Her words hung in the air, and for a moment, she felt exposed, like she had laid her soul bare. But then Daniel nodded, his expression filled with understanding. "Fear is powerful," he said softly. "But so is courage. And the fact that you're here, sharing this, shows that you're already stronger than you think." Clara felt a lump rise in her throat, but she managed a small nod. The session continued, but she barely heard the other voices. Her mind was spinning, replaying the words she had just spoken. For so long, she had let fear dictate her choices, keeping her trapped in a cycle of doubt and regret. But now, for the first time, she felt a glimmer of something different, a faint, flickering hope that maybe, just maybe, she could break free. That afternoon, Clara found herself drawn back to the waterfall. She hadn't planned to return, but something about the place felt unfinished, like there was something she needed to confront. The trail was quiet, the crunch of her boots the only sound as she made her way through the trees. When she reached the clearing, the sight of the cascading water took her breath away once again. It was as powerful and relentless as she remembered, a reminder of the forces that shape and reshape the world, no matter how unyielding they seem. Clara stood at the edge of the water, her heart pounding. She thought about everything that had brought her to this moment, the heartbreak, the doubts, the fears that had weighed her down for so long. She thought about the stories she had heard during the retreat, the courage of the people who had shared their truths. And she thought about her grandmother, about the way she had faced life's challenges with an open heart and an unshakable belief in the beauty of it all. Without thinking, Clara stepped closer to the water, her feet slipping slightly on the wet rocks. The roar of the waterfall was deafening now, drowning out every other sound. She closed her eyes, letting the mist wash over her, and for a moment, she felt weightless. She thought about the feather she had held earlier, about the lightness it symbolized. She thought about the cage Mia had described, the one that kept the bird trapped even when the door was open. And she made a decision. Clara opened her eyes and stared at the waterfall, her pulse racing. She didn't know what the future held, didn't know if she would succeed or fail. But she knew one thing: she couldn't keep living in fear. She couldn't keep holding on to the past, to the version of herself that had been too afraid to take risks. It was time to let go, to step out of the cage and spread her wings, no matter how terrifying it seemed. The sound of footsteps behind her startled her, and she turned to see Mia approaching, her face flushed from the hike. "I thought I might find you here," Mia said, smiling. "It's kind of your spot now, isn't it?" Clara laughed softly, the tension in her chest easing just a little.
"Maybe."
"It's peaceful." Mia nodded, her gaze shifting to the waterfall. "It's also powerful. Kind of reminds you that no matter what happens, life keeps moving forward." Clara didn't respond, but Mia's words settled deep in her heart. Life did keep moving, whether she was ready or not. And maybe that was the point. Maybe she didn't have to have all the answers right now. Maybe it was enough to take one step at a time, to trust that she could find her way. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the water, Clara felt a sense of clarity she hadn't felt in years. The conflicts and doubts that had consumed her weren't resolved, not yet. But for the first time, she felt like she was ready to face them. She didn't know what the next chapter of her life would look like, but she knew one thing: it was time to start writing it. As Clara and Mia walked back from the waterfall, the golden light of the setting sun filtered through the trees, casting long shadows on the trail. Clara felt lighter, as if she had left something behind at the water's edge. She couldn't quite explain it, but for the first time in a long while, she felt the faint stirrings of hope, like she might be able to find her way, even if she didn't know exactly where she was headed. They were nearing the retreat center when Mia stopped suddenly, her hand brushing Clara's arm. "Did you hear that?" she asked, her voice low. Clara paused, straining to listen. At first, all she could hear was the distant hum of the wind and the rustling of leaves. But then, faintly, there it was, a muffled sound, like someone calling out from somewhere deep in the woods. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to send a chill down Clara's spine. "Maybe someone's lost," Mia said, glancing nervously toward the trees. Clara hesitated, her pulse quickening. The sound was distant, almost ghostly, but there was something about it that felt urgent. "We should check it out," she said finally, her voice firmer than she felt. Mia looked unsure but nodded, and the two of them veered off the main path, following the faint sound. The woods grew denser as they walked, the branches overhead forming a canopy that darkened the trail. Clara's heart pounded in her chest, and she kept glancing over her shoulder, half expecting to see someone or something emerging from the shadows. The voice grew louder as they moved deeper into the forest. It was clearer now, a woman's voice, though the words were still hard to make out. Clara exchanged a glance with Mia, both of them clearly uneasy, but unwilling to turn back. The retreat had been about facing fears, after all, and this felt like some kind of test. They rounded a bend, and suddenly the forest opened into a small clearing. In the center was an old, dilapidated cabin, its wooden walls weathered and covered in moss. The voice was coming from inside. Clara felt her breath catch, a strange mix of fear and curiosity gripping her. "Do you think it's safe?" Mia whispered, her eyes wide. Clara wasn't sure. The cabin looked like it had been abandoned for years, but the voice, soft, pleading, was unmistakable. Gathering her courage, she stepped forward, her boots crunching on the dry leaves. As they approached, the door creaked open slightly, as if nudged by the wind. But there was no wind. Clara froze, her instincts screaming at her to turn around and leave. But then she thought about everything she had been working toward this week, facing her fears, breaking free from the cage she had built around herself. She couldn't turn back now. "Hello," Clara called out, her voice trembling. For a moment, there was no response. The air felt thick, almost suffocating, and Clara's hand hovered near the doorframe. Then, suddenly, a figure emerged from the shadows inside the cabin. It was an older woman, her face pale and gaunt, her clothes tattered and worn. She looked at Clara and Mia with wide, unblinking eyes, her lips moving as if she were trying to speak but couldn't find the words. Clara's stomach dropped. There was something unsettling about the woman, something that made her want to back away. But she stayed rooted to the spot, unable to look away. "Are you okay?" Clara asked, her voice barely audible. The woman tilted her head, her gaze sharp and penetrating. "They told me no one would come," she said finally, her voice raspy and uneven. Clara felt a chill run down her spine. "Who told you that?" The woman didn't answer. Instead, she turned and disappeared back into the shadows of the cabin. Clara looked at Mia, who was gripping her arm tightly, her face pale. "We should leave," Mia whispered urgently. Clara wanted to agree, but something about the situation felt unfinished. She stepped forward, peering into the cabin. It was dark inside, the air thick with the smell of damp wood and decay. "Wait," she called out, her voice steadier now. "We can help you. Just tell us what's going on." The woman's voice came from somewhere deep inside the cabin, barely more than a whisper. "You shouldn't have come here." Before Clara could respond, the sound of footsteps echoed behind her, and she spun around, her heart racing. But there was no one there. Just the empty forest, the trees swaying slightly in the breeze. Mia grabbed her arm, pulling her back toward the path. "Clara, this is crazy. We need to go."
"Now?"
Clara hesitated, torn between the fear coursing through her and the sense that there was something important about this place, something she couldn't quite put into words. But as the shadows lengthened and the forest grew darker, she knew Mia was right. They couldn't stay here, not like this. Reluctantly, Clara allowed Mia to lead her back toward the retreat center. But as they walked, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig sent her heart racing. And when they finally emerged from the woods, Clara realized she was clutching the feather from earlier, her fingers trembling around its soft edges. That night, Clara couldn't stop thinking about the cabin. The woman's voice, her haunting words, they lingered in her mind, refusing to let go. She knew she should forget about it, focus on the progress she had made during the retreat. But deep down, she felt like the encounter had unlocked something, like it was connected to the very thing she had come here to find. As she lay awake in the darkness, staring at the ceiling, A single thought kept running through her mind. What if the door to my cage isn't the only one that's open? The morning after their unsettling experience in the woods, Clara couldn't shake the feeling that something was unfinished. She had barely slept, her mind replaying the encounter with the woman in the cabin. It felt like a warning, though she couldn't make sense of what it meant. Clara knew she should focus on the retreat's closing ceremony, but a part of her couldn't let it go. After breakfast, Clara found Mia sitting on the edge of the garden, nervously twirling a strand of her hair. "We have to go back," Clara said quietly, sitting down beside her. Mia's eyes widened, and she shook her head firmly.
No.
Absolutely not. Whatever was happening in that cabin, it's not for us to solve. Clara looked at her friend, sensing the fear beneath her words. "I know it's scary. Believe me, I feel it too. But don't you think it's strange? The retreat is supposed to help us face what we're holding on to. What if this is part of it? What if it's more than just a coincidence?" Mia sighed, clearly torn. "Clara, we don't even know what we're walking into. That woman, she wasn't normal." Clara nodded slowly. "I know. But I can't ignore it. I feel like I need to understand, even if it's terrifying." She paused, her voice softening. "You don't have to come with me. I'll go alone if I have to." Mia stared at her for a long moment, then let out a frustrated groan. "You're impossible, you know that?"
Fine.
"But if this turns into some horror movie situation, I'm blaming you." An hour later, they were back on the trail, the unease from the previous night growing stronger with every step. The forest seemed darker, the air heavier, as if the woods themselves were holding their breath. When they reached the clearing, the cabin looked even more foreboding in the daylight, its warped walls casting long shadows on the ground. Clara hesitated at the door, her heart pounding. She could feel Mia tense beside her, but she pushed the door open before she could second-guess herself. The inside of the cabin was just as she remembered, dark, damp, and unsettling. The faint smell of decay lingered in the air, and Clara's stomach churned. "Hellos," Clara called out, her voice echoing in the stillness. For a moment there was nothing. Then the woman's voice came from the shadows, soft but clear. "You came back." Clara turned toward the sound, her eyes adjusting to the dim light. The woman was sitting in the corner, her face partially hidden by her tangled hair. But now that Clara could see her more clearly, she noticed something strange. The woman wasn't just pale, her skin seemed almost translucent, as if she were fading. "Who are you?" Clara asked, her voice trembling. The woman lifted her head, her eyes locking onto Clara's. "I was like you once," she said, her voice carrying an eerie calmness. "Lost, afraid, searching for answers. But I waited too long. I let the fear consume me." Clara's breath caught. "What do you mean? What happened to you?" The woman's gaze softened, a hint of sadness in her expression. "This place, it's a mirror. It shows you what you're holding on to, what's keeping you trapped. But it can only show you the door. You're the one who has to walk through it." Clara felt a chill run down her spine. "And if you don't?" The woman's eyes darkened, and she glanced toward the shadowed corners of the room. "Then you become part of the mirror. A reflection of what could have been." Mia grabbed Clara's arm, her voice barely a whisper. "Clara, we need to leave."
Now?
But Clara couldn't move. The woman's words struck something deep within her, a truth she couldn't ignore. She thought about her life, about all the moments she had let fear and doubt dictate her choices. And she realized with startling clarity that she was standing at a crossroads. "I don't want to become a reflection," Clara said quietly, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her. "I want to move forward." The woman nodded slowly. "Then let go. Trust yourself enough to take the first step." Before Clara could respond, the air in the cabin shifted. The shadows seemed to ripple, and the woman's form began to fade. Clara's heart raced as she watched the woman dissolve into the air, her final words lingering like an echo. "You'll find what you're looking for if you're brave enough to see it." And then she was gone. Clara stood frozen, her mind racing to make sense of what had just happened. But before she could process it, Mia tugged her arm, pulling her toward the door. "Clara, this place isn't safe. We need to go." They stumbled out into the clearing, the sunlight blinding after the darkness of the cabin. Clara felt her chest heaving, her heart pounding like a drum. But as she looked back at the cabin, a strange sense of calm washed over her. "Did you see it?" she asked Mia, her voice quiet. Mia frowned. "See what?" Clara hesitated, glancing back at the cabin. "The woman. The way she disappeared." Mia shook her head, her expression a mix of confusion and fear. "Clara, there was no one there. You were talking to an empty room." Clara's breath caught, and she felt the ground shift beneath her. Had it all been in her mind? Or had she seen something Mia couldn't? Either way, the truth was undeniable. The cabin, the woman, the retreat, they had all led her to this moment. A moment where she could finally let go of the fear that had held her captive for so long. As they walked back to the retreat center, Clara felt a weight lift from her chest. The world seemed brighter, sharper, as if she were seeing it for the first time. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, she wasn't afraid to find out. What she didn't see, as they disappeared down the trail, was the faint flicker of movement in the cabin's window. A shadow, watching, waiting, as if it knew Clara's story wasn't finished yet. The walk back to the retreat center felt quieter than ever. Clara and Mia didn't speak much, the weight of what had happened in the cabin hanging between them like an unspoken question. Clara's mind was swirling, not just with the woman's haunting words, but with the realization that Mia hadn't seen her at all. Could it really have been in Clara's head? And if so, why had it felt so real? By the time they reached the retreat center, the sky was shifting into hues of orange and pink, the sun dipping low on the horizon. Other participants were gathered in small groups, chatting and laughing as if nothing unusual had happened. It was such a stark contrast to the strange, heavy experience in the woods that Clara felt a sense of unreality, as though she were walking through a dream. Mia finally broke the silence as they reached their cabin. "Clara, are you okay?" she asked, her voice soft but filled with concern. Clara looked at her friend and nodded slowly. "I think so," she said, though the words felt uncertain even as she spoke them. I feel like everything's changed. Like something's shifted inside me." Mia gave her a faint smile, though her worry was still evident. "That's what this retreat is for, right? To face the things we've been avoiding." Clara knew Mia was trying to make sense of it in her own way, but she also sensed that Mia didn't truly understand what had happened in the cabin, or what it had meant. And maybe that was okay. Some things weren't meant to be fully explained. That evening, as the group gathered for the retreat's closing ceremony, Clara felt a sense of calm settle over her. The facilitators spoke about growth, transformation, and the courage it takes to let go of the things that hold us back. Clara listened, their words sinking in deeper than they ever had before. When it was her turn to share, Clara stood, her hands trembling slightly as she spoke. "I came here feeling stuck," she began, her voice shaky but gaining strength with each word. "I've spent so much of my life afraid of failure, of disappointment, of letting people down. But what I realized here is that the fear was never really about those things. It was about me not believing I was strong enough to handle whatever came next. And for the first time, I feel like I am." There was a pause, then the room erupted into applause. Clara felt a warmth spread through her chest, a mix of pride and relief. She had never been one to speak so openly, but in that moment it felt right. It felt like the final step in letting go. That night, Clara sat outside on the cabin's porch, gazing up at the stars. Mia was already asleep, but Clara wasn't ready to rest yet. She thought about the woman in the cabin, her cryptic words, and the strange way she had disappeared. Whether it had been real or not, the experience had changed Clara. It had forced her to confront her deepest fears, to see herself in a way she never had before. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the feather she had found at the waterfall. It felt different now, less like a mystery and more like a reminder. A symbol of the freedom she had been searching for, even if she hadn't known it at the time. As she sat there, a sense of peace washed over her. For the first time in years, she didn't feel weighed down by the what-ifs and the doubts. She didn't have all the answers, but she realized she didn't need them. The journey itself was enough. The next morning, as the retreat came to an end, Clara and Mia packed their bags and said their goodbyes. The drive back to the city was quiet, but it wasn't an uncomfortable silence. It was the kind of quiet that felt full, like words weren't necessary. As they pulled into Clara's driveway, Mia turned to her and smiled. "So, what's next for you?" Clara thought for a moment, then smiled back. "I don't know," she admitted. "But for the first time, that doesn't scare me." Mia nodded, as if she understood. "Well, whatever it is, I know you'll figure it out." Clara stepped out of the car and waved as Mia drove away. Standing in front of her house, she felt the familiar pull of routine, the emails, the deadlines, the never-ending to-do lists. But this time, it didn't feel overwhelming. It felt manageable. She took a deep breath and stepped inside, her mind already racing with ideas. She thought about starting a new project, maybe something creative. She thought about reconnecting with old friends, about taking more risks, about living in a way that felt truer to who she was. Later that night, as she sat at her desk, Clara noticed the feather lying on the windowsill where she had placed it. She picked it up, running her fingers over its soft edges. It wasn't just a feather anymore. It was a reminder of what she had found, of the strength she had discovered within herself. And as she placed it back on the windowsill, she smiled, knowing that whatever came next, she was ready.